Today's lesson is on school districts and school funding in Texas. And I want to focus a little bit on just give you an overview of how it works, but also focus on a couple of questions that have been debated for 50 years, almost literally 50 years in Texas, which is basically, is the school funding system we have fair, and is it constitutional? And there are two ways to ask whether or not it's constitutional. Does it violate the U.S. Constitution? Does it violate the Texas Constitution? There have been many court battles and disputes and debates over those two questions over the last several decades. So the Texas Constitution says in Article 7, a general diffusion of knowledge being essential to the preservation of the liberties and rights of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislature of the state to establish and make suitable provision for the support and maintenance of an efficient system of public free schools. So a lot of ideas there. It is the duty of the legislature, so the legislature has some constitutional duty to provide schools. What kind of schools? It says an efficient system. And that was kind of the debated term. Do we have an efficient system or not? So first, a little overview of some of the numbers of the public education in Texas. So this data is about 4 years old, but the Texas Education Agency in 2018 said that there are about 1,200 school districts in Texas, a little bit more than that, maybe 1,201. That includes 179 districts that are operating charter schools. There are almost 9,000 campuses in Texas, and that includes 705 charter school campuses. In 2018, there were 358,525 teachers and 5.43 million students in Texas. So a lot of people, a lot of campuses, a lot of employees. I found these graphs and I thought they were interesting. These are also from 2018, 2019, so they're slightly out of date, but still I think fairly useful. So you can see that in terms of funding of education, about 6% of our public school funding is federal. That means from the U.S. government. And then about 44% is from the state and 50% is local. Now that's probably been adjusted briefly, a little bit, because there was a recent law passed that I'll get to in the end that upped the state contribution and therefore lowered the local contribution a little bit. But it's still, those numbers are still fairly accurate. In terms of what the money is spent on, you can see 60% is spent on instruction. And then there's transportation, plant services, food services, administration and support. And then another way of looking at the spending is this chart on the far right, and it says 68% of the spending is payroll. So almost 2/3 of what the school districts spend money on is people, employees. One aspect of our funding is something called the Permanent School Fund, and I think I mentioned this briefly in a prior class about the General Land Office. But the school fund was established by the Texas legislature in 1854. Initially it was called the Special School Fund, and then a little bit later they changed the name to the Permanent School Fund. And it was intended to fund the state's public school system. It was endowed initially with $2 million from money that was paid to Texas by the United States government in return for Texas's claim to territory in parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Oklahoma. If you remember seeing old maps of Texas from when it was a republic, the borders that Texas claimed were different from today. They followed the Rio Grande all the way up through New Mexico and Colorado, and Texas claimed all that land, Well, in exchange for giving up that claim, the U.S. government paid Texas millions of dollars, and that money was used to start the school fund. So the Permanent School Fund provides revenues for public primary and secondary education in Texas. Its assets include publicly owned lands in Texas and various other investments. As of the end of fiscal 2020, the fund had an endowment of $48 billion. The land and its assets are managed by the Texas General Land Office, and royalties on oil and gas extraction are the fund's major source of revenues. The Land Office reinvests these revenues and manages the investments. And the interest produced by the fund's investments is distributed to the state's public school districts in proportion to their average daily student attendance. But the fund itself isn't spent. The interest on the fund is distributed to the school districts, but the fund itself is meant to just keep growing and growing. These charts, this one and the next page, are somewhat interesting. By no means are you going to be expected to know every little detail that's on them. But if you just look at the far right, I mentioned oil and gas royalties, right? So the oil and gas royalties go into the Permanent University Fund, which funds our two main university systems, the University of Texas system and the Texas A&M system. And they have schools around the state. And then the Permanent School Fund, which is the focus today, this is the part that's managed by the General Land Office and also by the State Board of Education, and it winds its way into the Foundation School Program where the money is distributed to school districts. This particular chart says that in fiscal year 20 there was $46.7 billion in the school fund. Over here it tells you that the Land Office manages 13 million acres and the mineral rights on those acres. And it received an estimated $1.1 billion in royalties in 2019. So a lot of money coming from the oil and gas production that helps support the schools. The Texas Education Agency oversees the public school systems, as well as the charter schools. It's divided into 20 educational service center regions that serve the local school districts. A little bit about school governments. So Texas school districts are governed by locally elected school boards and superintendents. And the boards of these independent school districts are elected by the citizens of the communities, while the boards of charter schools are appointed. The school board oversees the management of the districts or charter school and ensures that the superintendent implements and monitors district operations. School board members, like I said, are generally elected by the residents or the citizens of the school district, and boards can consist of 5, 7, or 9 members, and they serve terms of 3 or 4 years. And these are voluntary jobs. These are not paid politicians. These are usually local people who have an interest in the education and therefore are interested in serving on the school board. This little graph here shows, it's about 10 years old, but again, it's fairly accurate, what Texas spends its money on. So about 27% of the Texas budget is on K through 12 education. You can see Medicaid is even bigger, 31%. So K through 12 education, public school education that I'm talking about today, accounts for a little over a fourth of Texas's spending. And like I said, it's 10 years old, but it's still fairly accurate. At the bottom, it says per pupil spending is $8,299. That's a little bit outdated. It's closer to $10,000 per pupil these days. Now, how do school boards decide the property tax rate? So school boards generally must set a tax rate of at least $1 per $100 in property value, and most go above that. And depending on the tax rates, wealthier districts have to give up some of their property tax avenue to recapture, and that money goes to poorer districts. And I'll explain more of what I mean by that in a few minutes. So on this chart, you can see on the far left, if the school board taxes from $1 to $1.04 per $100 of property value, that tax rate doesn't have to be approved by voters. So they can adjust it up and down from $1 to $1.01 up to $1.04, and they can just adjust it back up and down as they see fit, right? Above that, they have to get voter approval. And then if they tax at the top rate, that's going to be $1.17. Notice this said 60% of wealthy districts tax at the $1.04 rate. They don't need to tax any higher because their property values are high and they can get all the money they need at that lower rate. Whereas the poorer districts are often maxed out at $1.17. What does that mean? They have to tax at the highest rate they're allowed to by the state to get as much money as they can because the property values are low. Whereas in a property value high district, you don't have to have a high rate, you can have a lower rate, but the high property values generate plenty of revenue. I found these charts and I thought they were interesting for getting at that topic that I alluded to earlier. Does the Texas system, is it fair or is it constitutional? I asked. And what people have in mind when they ask that question is the discrepancy in funding from one district to another in Texas. So on the left, you can see the national average for funding is $11,841 per pupil. And in Texas, some districts are well above that national average, but others are well below it, right? So you can see the dark green are districts that are funding per pupil well above the national average. There was one up here, I think it was this one up near the border with Oklahoma, where the per pupil average was about $20,000 per student, almost twice the national average. But then there are others, you look at where the red is, the red shows that it's at least 33% below the national average. And these tend to be our big urban areas like Houston, Dallas, Austin, even a lot of the poorer rural areas like in the Valley and in the Austin and San Antonio area, in East Texas, of course, as well, tend to be poorer counties. They're below the national average. So you have a big discrepancy where there are some, school districts that have 15,000, 20,000 per pupil, and some with significantly less. And then on the right, I have a chart showing similar information. These are the 20 largest school districts in Texas, and these are 2018 figures. So again, it's 4 years ago. It's not perfect, but it's close enough to show the point I'm trying to make. The blue line is the only part that you really need to look at. These other bars aren't really very important for this purpose. But Frisco spends a little under 8,000 per pupil, or right about 8,000 per pupil, whereas San Antonio and Austin spend closer to 12,000 per pupil. So a difference of 8,000 to 12,000, that's a pretty significant difference, right? Percentage-wise. So the question that arises always is that fair? Is it fair for a student to get 8,000 per pupil in one district, but 12,000 per pupil in a different district, just depending upon where he or she lives? More information about that. This is a list of school districts in Bexar County. So Bexar County is the county around San Antonio, and you can see a discrepancy there. 10,000 for Edgewood per student, Comal ISD 7,000. Edgewood's going to come up again because about 50 years ago, that's where a lot of the arguments, a lot of the court battles about funding in Texas began. So this chart, this graph, again, is a few years old now. But it shows you, it's meant to show you simply the discrepancy between two school districts in Bexar County. So they're right next to each other or they're nearer to each other. But Edgewood has property value, which is significantly less than Alamo Heights. Edgewood is a very poor part of San Antonio. Alamo Heights is a relatively wealthy part of San Antonio. So the property value in Alamo Heights is almost, well, it's over 5 times as much as Edgewood. So what does that mean? Alamo Heights can have a tax rate much lower than the Edgewood tax rate, but it can generate far more money, right? And that's because the property values are so much higher. So, about 50 years ago, a Supreme Court case arose out of all of this called San Antonio Independent School District versus Rodriguez. This is Demetrio Rodriguez. He was the son of migrant workers. He was a military veteran, and at the time that this was being litigated, he was a civilian employee at a U.S. Air Force base in San Antonio. He had 5 children. They attended the Edgewood Independent School District, and he became concerned that they had not enough money for new buildings, for new books, for better teachers. And he investigated, and he realized that nearby school districts like Alamo Heights had far more money, better facilities, more money to pay their teachers, etc. And he and 15 other parents formed a group called the Edgewood Concerned Parent Association, and they sued a bunch of school districts: San Antonio ISD, hence the name of the lawsuit, Alamo Heights ISD, 5 other school districts, the Bexar County School Trustees, and the state of Texas. The lawsuit was called Rodriguez et al. V. San Antonio ISD. Their attorney, Arthur Gachman, argued that education was a fundamental right and that people in poor school districts faced discrimination because property wealth drove school funding, which violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Let me focus on what that means for just a second. So the 14th Amendment guarantees the right to equal protection of the laws. And the plaintiffs alleged that education is a fundamental right. In other words, you have a constitutional right to education, just like you have a constitutional right to free speech, freedom of religion, to vote, things like that, all right? So he was saying this is of equal constitutional importance. The Constitution protects this just as it does those other things. And they are being discriminated against. In this case, the parents were almost exclusively Mexican American, but they were discriminated against because they were poor, was the argument, right? And so that violated their equal protection rights. So the lawyer said, if this was a rich guy in a poor district, we wouldn't be in court. He'd just move. But the poor have no way out of the present system. The Supreme Court ruled against the parents, 5-4, so close ruling. They said that the financing system in Texas, which was based on local property taxes, did not violate the Constitution. They said education is not a fundamental right under the U.S. Constitution. So the Supreme Court disagreed with this. It's not like speech. It's not like religion. It doesn't invoke that close protection, that close scrutiny that those issues would invite. And therefore the parents lost. So basically they were saying the system isn't perfect, but the Constitution doesn't entitle you to a perfect system. Right? Was what it came down to. I have a picture here of his children. Demetrio passed away a few years ago. His daughter Patty teaches in Edgewood ISD, which is where the whole lawsuit began. She says that the disparities are still there. And she says to think that this could have been fixed a long time ago, it's frustrating to still see some of those same things happening, and until who knows when this is going to get fixed. It's been called all kinds of names, but it comes down to the same basic idea that all schools should be funded equally based not on what side of town you live on or how much your house is worth, it's how much your children's education is worth. So she clearly thinks that the Supreme Court was wrong in that 5-4 decision. Now, next, people who thought the education system in Texas was unfair turned to the state courts. So not the federal courts, because they had lost in the U.S. Supreme Court. So in 1984, an organization called the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund filed suit against State Commissioner of Education William Kirby on behalf of the Edgewood Independent School District, citing discrimination against students in poor school districts. So the same plaintiffs, in a sense, right, the people of Edgewood, but now they're suing the state in state court. So the plaintiffs argued that the state's methods of funding public schools violated the Texas state constitution, which required the state to provide an efficient public school system. So it's a different argument. They're saying, remember, the Texas Constitution says that the legislature must provide an efficient system, and the plaintiffs are saying they fail. It's not efficient, so the Constitution of Texas is being violated. Edgewood Independent School District versus Kirby eventually went to the Texas Supreme Court, which unanimously sided with Edgewood. So that led to an attempt on the part of the Texas legislature to overhaul the system. The Supreme Court had ruled that it was unconstitutional, but remember, the Texas Constitution, right, it was being violated. And it took 2 or 3 tries, and there were several years worth of court battles. But what they came up with was a system called recapture, and nicknamed Robin Hood. And the idea, basically, was that, well, it's stated right there, so I'll just read that little part to it. It says, the state's recapture law, or Robin Hood, requires school districts considered property wealthy to share portions of their tax revenue in an effort to correct funding inequities across the state. So this is like 7 years old now, but just using these as an example, 7 years ago, Austin ISD had to give to the state $231.9 million in excess property tax revenue. And then that revenue was dispersed to poorer school districts in other parts of the state, right? That's what we call it Robin Hood. It takes from the wealthy districts and gives to the poor ones. Highland Park was in second place. That's a wealthy neighborhood near Dallas, and they had to share $82.2 million. Plano ISD, again, that's near Dallas, $60.1 million. Catula is down in South Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley area. They had to share $55 million. And so that's the gist of the system. This chart on the right, this map on the right, shows you the red districts are the districts all over the state that are recapture districts, meaning those are districts that had to pay excess money to the Texas Education Agency. And then the non-recapture districts are in gray, and many of those received some of that extra money because their property tax revenue was too low. Now, fast forward a few years, and there are 2 large groups of people who are still unsatisfied with the system. And ironically, this is both really poor school districts and really rich school districts. Neither one of them is really happy. The poor school districts are unhappy because they're still poor, right? And even with Robin Hood, even with recapture, there is still a huge discrepancy between how much money they have per pupil and how much money the rich school districts have. The rich school districts are unhappy too, because some of them, like Austin, are giving $200 million of their property tax revenue to the state, and they're like, well, this system seems to screw everybody. So, over 600 Texas school districts sued the state about 10 years ago. And that trial, or that lawsuit was called Texas Taxpayers and Student Fairness Coalition versus Williams. Williams was the state Board of Education chairperson at the time, I think. So the lawyers argued that the state's method of funding public schools was unconstitutional, that the legislature had failed to provide districts with sufficient funding to ensure students meet the state's increasingly difficult academic standards, that big disparities had emerged between property wealthy and property poor school districts, and that many school districts were having to tax at the maximum rate just to provide a basic education, meaning they lacked meaningful discretion to set rates. In a 2014 ruling, Travis County District Court Judge John Dietz, I don't have him pictured here, he upheld all of those claims, siding with the plaintiff school districts. He ruled that the Texas school finance system violates the Texas Constitution. So again, we're still in Texas courts, and he's saying this clause, this guarantee that we will have an efficient system is still being violated all these years later. He ruled that the current funding system is constitutionally inadequate, unsuitable, and financially insufficient. So that was district court. It went on to the Texas Supreme Court, and that's the court that you can see in this picture here. So, in 2016, the Texas Supreme Court overruled the district court and said that the system is constitutional. In the ruling, the court urged the state lawmakers to implement transformational, top-to-bottom reforms that amount to more than Band-Aid on top of Band-Aid. It said our Byzantine school funding system is undeniably imperfect, with immense room for improvement, but it satisfies minimum constitutional requirements. There were no dissenting opinions. All 9 of the Texas Supreme Court judges agreed. It was a unanimous verdict. Eva Guzman, who was on the Supreme Court, now she's retired, she said, good enough now does not mean that the system is good or that it will continue to be good enough. Shortfalls in both resources and performance persist in innumerable respects, and a perilously large number of students is in danger of falling further behind. So basically, all 9 of the judges said, we don't like the system, but it's not unconstitutional. It doesn't violate the Texas Constitution. And that was the end, for now, of court battles, of legal battles over the constitutionality of our funding system. I briefly alluded to this at the beginning of the lecture. In 2019, Texas did pass an important law. Governor Abbott demanded it in his inaugural speech in 2019, and it was signed that summer in June of 2019. It was an $11.6 billion school finance measure that included $6.5 billion in new public education spending, plus about $5.1 billion devoted to lowering Texans' property tax bills. Here's the key parts. It increases per student base funding by about 20% to $6,160. So now the state pays $6,160 per pupil to each school district in Texas. The old number was about $5,000, so this was about a 20% raise. And this was important because it meant all those poor school districts all across Texas would get a boost, in their per pupil funding, and they would then have to rely a little bit less on Robin Hood or recapture. And since they would have to rely a little bit less on Robin Hood and recapture, even the other school districts wouldn't have to pay into the system as much as they had been. At least that was the idea. So you can see this chart. For several years, it had been stable at $5,140 per student, what the Texas government paid. Local governments still pay more through their property taxes. Now, the baseline from the Texas Education Agency is $6,160 per pupil. And is that enough? Does that mean the system is fair now? The people who sued in San Antonio v. Rodriguez and Edgewood versus Kirby still don't think it's fair. But, you know, Abbott and his supporters since 2019 think it's at least a little bit better. That's it for today.